I sat in the cramped office staring at the chipped paint on the walls while the social worker flipped through my paperwork with increasing focus and concern written across her face. Her brow tightened as she read something on one of the forms, then she looked up at me with confusion and something like sympathy in her eyes. "Can you explain why your parents marked no contact on this form and listed your address as unknown?" she asked carefully, her voice gentle but probing. That simple question strung harder than any argument I'd ever had with them over the years we'd been in conflict. I felt my chest tighten as the words sank in slowly, the meaning becoming clearer with each passing second that stretched between us. I realized this wasn't just abandonment or emotional distance. It was an intentional erasure of me from their lives, documented in writing for an official government agency to see and process and act upon. The room felt smaller suddenly, the air thicker and harder to breathe, as I struggled to process what she was telling me about my own parents and their actions. They hadn't just ignored my calls or given me the cold shoulder during a difficult time in my life. They had actively lied to a government agency to make it seem like I didn't exist to them anymore, like they had no idea where I was or how to reach me even though we'd spoken just weeks ago about my situation. My hands started shaking in my lap as I tried to form coherent words to answer her question, but my throat felt tight, and my mind was racing through every interaction I'd had with them recently, searching for clues I'd missed. Months earlier, everything had felt different between us, or at least I thought it had at the time. My parents had promised to help figure something out when I first mentioned struggling to pay rent after losing my second job in 6 months through no fault of my own. They had nodded sympathetically across the dinner table at their house, asking for specific details about my bills and income, and what kind of assistance I needed from them to get through this rough patch. Nothing had seemed hostile or angry then, just a kind of distant concern that felt normal for them given our relationship over the years and how they'd always been. My father had said something vague about looking into their savings account to see what they could spare without putting themselves in a difficult position, and my mother had mentioned asking around about job openings in her professional network that might be a good fit for me. I had held on to hope that family support would eventually come through, even if it took some time for them to figure out logistics and how much they could realistically help without straining their own finances. They were my parents after all, and despite our complicated history and the ups and downs we'd experienced throughout my childhood and young adulthood, I genuinely believed they wouldn't let me become homeless or desperate for basic necessities. I left their house that evening feeling cautiously optimistic that we would work through this crisis together as a family should. The way I'd always imagined families were supposed to support each other during hard times and genuine emergencies that couldn't be predicted or avoided. But then calls started going unanswered within just a few weeks of that dinner conversation I'd thought had gone well between us. Then my messages were ignored completely, left on read with no response or acknowledgement that they'd even seen them or cared about what I was saying. The family group chats stayed active and busy. I could see my siblings posting updates about their lives and my parents responding to them with enthusiasm and interest and questions. But my messages in those same chats were systematically ignored, as if I'd become invisible to everyone in the family overnight. The slow shift felt deliberate and calculated, like I was being pushed out of my own family one small step at a time, in a way that was coordinated between my parents and possibly my siblings. I wondered constantly if I had unknowingly done something wrong to deserve this treatment from the people who raised me and claimed to love me. Had I said something offensive at that dinner that I didn't realize was hurtful or inappropriate to them? Had I asked for help in the wrong way or come across as entitled or ungrateful for what they'd already done for me throughout my life? I replayed every conversation in my head over and over obsessively, searching desperately for the moment I'd crossed some invisible line that had turned them against me so completely and suddenly. But I couldn't find it no matter how hard I tried to remember every detail. The silence from them was louder and more painful than any argument we'd ever had throughout my entire life with them, and it left me feeling confused and hurt and abandoned. When I finally managed to reach my father on the phone after trying for days and days without success to get through to either of them, he said curtly that he was busy with work and would talk to me later about everything when he had more time to focus on my situation and what I needed. Later never came, no matter how many times I followed up with calls and messages asking when would be good for him to have that conversation we'd planned. My mother sent a short text message a week after that conversation implying I needed to stand on my own 2 feet like an adult and figure things out independently without relying on them for support at my age. The tone felt rehearsed and cold, like she'd practiced what to say or discussed it with my father beforehand in detail, like they had already decided something about me behind closed doors without including me in the conversation, or giving me a chance to defend myself, or explain my situation fully to them. There was no warmth in her words, no acknowledgement of our relationship or my genuine struggle to survive financially and emotionally during this difficult period. It felt like reading a message, meant for a stranger rather than her own child, who she'd raised for over 2 decades with love and care. I started to realize they weren't just busy or stressed with their own lives and obligations. They had made a conscious decision about me, and were executing it methodically without explanation or discussion or any opportunity for me to understand what I'd done wrong in their eyes. A cousin I barely spoke to casually mentioned during a phone call out of the blue that she'd heard I'd been making irresponsible decisions with money, and that's why I was struggling financially so badly right now. That was the first clear sign that my parents had been actively changing the narrative about me to the extended family behind my back without my knowledge. I was stunned into silence on the phone, because nothing could be further from the truth about my situation or my character, or how I'd been living. I'd lost my job due to company downsizing and budget cuts that affected dozens of employees across multiple departments, not because of anything I'd done wrong or any poor performance on my part that I could have prevented. I'd been living frugally and responsibly for years, tracking every expense carefully, and saving what I could whenever possible for emergencies just like this. But somehow, my parents had managed to paint a completely different picture to everyone who would listen to them and believe their version without questioning it. I realized the entire family was being primed to view me as the problem, as someone who'd created their own crisis through poor choices and immaturity, and lack of planning for the future. The foundation was being laid carefully for my parents to justify whatever they were planning to do next, and I was powerless to stop the rumors from spreading through our large extended family network across multiple states. Rent and medical bills continued piling up on my kitchen counter in threatening stacks that grew taller each week despite my best efforts to manage them. I kept trying desperately to reach my parents through every method I could think of: calls, texts, emails, even messages through my siblings who I hoped might advocate for me, not even for money anymore, but just for guidance or emotional support or acknowledgement that I existed and mattered to them as their child. Each attempt was met with complete silence or a vague excuse that led nowhere, and offered no real help or comfort or connection. The emotional weight of being ignored and rejected by the people who raised me felt heavier than the actual financial stress, crushing me from all sides every single day. I would lie awake at night wondering what I'd done to deserve this treatment from my own parents, who I'd always tried to have a good relationship with, replaying childhood memories, and searching for clues about when they'd stopped caring about me or loving me unconditionally, the way parents were supposed to. The abandonment felt personal in a way that scared me deeply, like I was fundamentally unlovable or defective in some way I couldn't see or understand about myself and my worth as a person, and as their child. With nowhere else to turn and eviction notices piling up threatening to make me homeless within weeks if I didn't come up with the money, I finally swallowed my pride and applied for temporary assistance through the county social services office downtown. It felt deeply embarrassing to admit I needed government help when I'd always been independent and self-sufficient and proud of taking care of myself, but it was absolutely necessary for survival at this point in my life. I filled out the forms as honestly and completely as I could, providing every detail they asked for about my income, expenses, living situation, and family situation without leaving anything out. I listed my parents as emergency contacts because that's what the form required, and because they were still technically my next of kin despite everything that had happened between us recently and the distance that had grown. I assumed naively that they would simply confirm basic details if contacted by the agency, maybe verify that I existed and that we were related, and that my story was legitimate and true and not exaggerated. I never imagined in my worst nightmares that they would actively sabotage my attempt to get help during a genuine crisis that threatened my housing and well-being and basic survival. The application process felt humiliating, but I told myself it was temporary, just until I could get back on my feet and find stable employment again in my field or something close to it that would pay the bills. During my intake appointment at the social services office downtown, The social worker asked a few questions that didn't make sense to me at the time or seem relevant. Things like whether my parents were currently aware of my situation or whether we'd had recent contact within the past 6 months that I could document with evidence like text messages or call logs. I answered truthfully and honestly that yes, I'd spoken to them several times about my struggles and had asked them directly for help, though they'd been distant and unhelpful and ultimately unresponsive to my pleas. Something felt off about her line of questioning, like she was trying to confirm something specific, or catch me in a lie or inconsistency in my story, but I couldn't place what was bothering her, or why she seemed concerned about my answers or skeptical. She made careful notes on her papers without explaining to me why these particular questions mattered so much to my case, or what she was looking for in my responses. I left that appointment feeling confused and anxious without understanding why, with a nagging feeling that something was wrong, but not knowing what it could possibly be, or what I should be worried about going forward with the application. When the social worker called me back in for a follow-up meeting a week later and slid the paperwork across the desk toward me with a serious expression on her face, everything suddenly clicked into horrible clarity that made my stomach drop. The forms stated clearly in black and white that my parents had reported they didn't know where I currently lived and hadn't spoken to me in several years at minimum. They had checked boxes indicating we were completely estranged and that they had no way to contact me or provide any information about my situation or circumstances or current well-being. It felt like a physical punch to my stomach, knocking all the air out of my lungs in one terrible moment that seemed to freeze time. I stared at their signatures on the document, proof that this wasn't a misunderstanding or miscommunication or clerical error that could be easily fixed with a phone call. This wasn't tough love or them trying to teach me independence through struggle. It was intentional abandonment, disguised as something righteous and justified in their minds and their version of events. They had deliberately tried to cut me off from assistance by lying to a government agency, making it seem like I had no family support system available because I'd somehow driven them away through my own actions or behavior or choices that made me unworthy. I went home to my tiny apartment and finally broke down completely, sobbing on my bathroom floor until I couldn't breathe properly and my chest hurt. Seeing their lies written in official documentation made it impossible to rationalize the situation anymore or make excuses for their behavior toward me as their child. I replayed every ignored call, every cold message, every family gathering I'd been excluded from over the past months since this started. The betrayal felt deeper than anything I had ever experienced in my life. Worse than any romantic breakup or friendship ending I'd gone through in the past that had hurt me. These were the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, who were supposed to be there when life got hard and scary and overwhelming, and I needed them most. Instead, they had actively worked against me while I was drowning and desperate for any kind of support or acknowledgement or help. I cried until my eyes were swollen and my head pounded with pain, grieving the parents I thought I had, and accepting the painful reality of who they actually were beneath the surface they presented to the world and to me throughout my childhood. Instead of calling them again to demand explanations or beg for acknowledgement of what they'd done to me, I sat with the painful truth for several days, in silence and isolation. My parents weren't confused or unsure about what was happening in my life. They had actively and consciously chosen this path of abandonment and erasure without remorse. They had made a decision to erase me from their lives, and had been executing that plan methodically and deliberately for months without my knowledge or understanding of what was coming. Accepting this reality meant reevaluating my entire childhood and upbringing, questioning which moments had been genuine love, and which had been performance or obligation or maintaining appearances for others. Had they ever really loved me unconditionally, or had I always been conditional in their eyes, valued only when I met their expectations and standards, and didn't cause them problems? That question was more painful than the current financial crisis I was facing day to day and struggling to survive. It struck at the very core of who I thought I was and where I came from and what my worth was as a person in this world. Social worker, to my genuine surprise, stepped in more than her job technically required of her according to the rules. She guided me through resources and programs I didn't know existed in the county system, making phone calls on my behalf and cutting through bureaucratic red tape that would have taken me weeks to navigate alone without help or guidance. For the first time in months, someone was being straightforward and actively supportive without judgment or conditions attached to their assistance or help. That quiet kindness gave me a moment to breathe and regroup when I'd been suffocating under stress and fear about my future and what would happen to me. She didn't ask intrusive questions about why my parents had lied on official forms, or what our family dynamics were like historically, or what had caused this rift between us. She just focused practically on getting me the help I needed to survive this immediate crisis and get back on my feet financially and emotionally. Her professionalism and genuine compassion reminded me that not everyone would abandon me when things got difficult and complicated in my life, and I needed support most. Over the next few weeks, I secured temporary benefits and negotiated payment plans with my landlord and medical providers that kept me housed and safe for now at least. It wasn't glamorous or comfortable, but it was genuine progress towards stability and independence that I could build on going forward. Each small step forward made my parents' abandonment feel less like a defining tragedy that would destroy me and more like a reveal of their true character that I'd been blind to for years of my life. I was surviving despite them, not because of them, and that realization was strangely empowering in a way I hadn't expected at all given how hurt I was. I started keeping a detailed journal to document my progress, partly for my own mental health and emotional processing, and partly because I had a strong feeling I might need evidence of the truth someday when confronted by family members who believed my parents' version. Co-workers and acquaintances I'd never been particularly close to began stepping in with unexpected support that touched me deeply and surprised me completely. Someone offered me rides to job interviews when my car broke down and I couldn't afford repairs immediately or even a tow. Another brought me groceries without being asked, just showing up at my door with bags of food and necessities that I desperately needed. A neighbor helped me create a better resume and practiced interview questions with me for hours until I felt confident and prepared. Real human connection and community support sprouted in places where family support had failed completely and spectacularly, in ways I couldn't have imagined. I realized that chosen family and community bonds could be just as valuable as blood relations, sometimes even more so, because it was freely given without obligation or expectation of anything in return from me. These small acts of kindness from near strangers helped me see that my parents' rejection didn't mean I was fundamentally unworthy of love or help from others who saw my value. Word eventually trickled back through the family network that relatives were confused about why I hadn't contacted my parents during my crisis, that everyone seemed to know about somehow. It became abundantly clear that someone, obviously my parents, had been feeding the extended family selective information that painted a very different and misleading picture of events and what had actually happened. According to the family rumors circulating through aunts and uncles and cousins across the country, I had cut off my parents completely and refused their generous help and support when they offered it, not the other way around as had actually happened in reality. I stayed quiet and chose not to defend myself prematurely to every aunt and cousin who called with concerned questions and judgments about my character. I knew the truth would eventually surface on its own, without me having to argue my case to everyone individually, and I didn't have the emotional energy to fight a narrative battle while also fighting daily for basic survival and stability in my life. A distant aunt I'd always liked and trusted called me directly and asked with genuine confusion why my parents had claimed I cut them off completely, without any explanation or warning to them. That contradiction didn't match anything she'd heard from other sources or seen from my social media presence, where I'd been fairly open about struggling to find work and dealing with financial difficulties. It was the first sign that my parents' carefully constructed narrative wasn't holding up under scrutiny from people who actually knew me personally and could see through lies. Small cracks were forming in their story as family members started comparing notes and noticing inconsistencies in the timeline and details they'd been told by my parents. My aunt didn't believe their version of events at all, and she said so clearly and firmly. Which gave me hope that truth and reality still mattered to some people in my family who cared about me as a person. One relative mentioned casually during a family video call that my parents had admitted they weren't involved in my situation, because they didn't want to deal with unnecessary drama in their comfortable lives that they'd built. That small comment exposed everything about their true motivations and character underneath the facade they presented publicly. They weren't helpless or conflicted about how to help me during a crisis. They had deliberately and consciously opted out of supporting their own child during a genuine emergency because it was inconvenient for them and their lifestyle and reputation. The mask slipped completely, and several family members who heard that comment went completely silent on the call in shock at what they'd just heard. I could feel the shift in perception happening in real time across the family network as people reassessed everything. My parents had revealed themselves accidentally through their own careless words, and there was no walking it back or reframing it in a way that made them look good or justified. I finally made the difficult decision to share the social worker's paperwork with one trusted relative, my uncle who had always been fair and logical and supportive of me throughout my life. The bold lies documented on official government forms shocked him completely and visibly when he read through them carefully. He read through the documents twice carefully and slowly, absorbing every detail, then looked at me with something like heartbreak in his eyes for what had been through alone without family support. That relative quietly began correcting the family narrative piece by piece over the following weeks, having private conversations with other family members, and showing them photographic evidence when needed to prove the truth of what happened. He didn't make it dramatic or confrontational with my parents directly at family gatherings. He just calmly shared facts and documentation and let people draw their own conclusions about who was telling the truth and who was lying. The truth started spreading through the family like ripples in water, slowly but inevitably changing everyone's understanding of the situation and who I really was. As more relatives heard the actual truth and saw the documentation with their own eyes, attitudes shifted noticeably toward my parents in family gatherings and private conversations. People realized they hadn't just stepped back to let me handle things independently, as they'd claimed repeatedly. They had actively abandoned their own child during a genuine crisis, and then lied extensively about it to everyone who asked them what happened. Sympathy and understanding turned into quiet judgment and disappointment in their character and their choices. My parents started noticing the distance growing between them and extended family members at gatherings and holidays that were usually warm. Phone calls became shorter and less frequent, and more awkward with long silences. Invitations to family events came with awkward tension nobody acknowledged directly out of politeness and family obligation. Their social standing within the family, which had always been important to them and their identity and sense of self, began to crumble as people reconsidered who they really were beneath the respectable surface they presented to the world. My parents reached out to me for the first time in months, but not with concern, apology, or acknowledgement of what they'd done to me during my crisis. They contacted me with clear irritation in their voices, asking why people were misunderstanding the situation and getting the wrong idea about what had happened between us recently and why we weren't speaking. Their tone implied they still expected me to fix this problem for them, to somehow smooth things over with the family and restore their damaged reputation in the community they cared about. I stayed neutral and calm during the conversation, offering no emotional labor or explanations to make them feel better about themselves or their choices. I simply said that people were forming their own opinions based on available information and evidence, and I wasn't controlling that narrative or trying to poison anyone against them deliberately or unfairly. The conversation was brief and unsatisfying for them, and they hung up frustrated and angry that I wouldn't help them. The lies my parents had written on the assistance forms triggered a brief administrative review by the County Social Services Department that handles these cases. Not for me. My application was approved without any issues or complications or questions about my honesty, but for them and their credibility as sources of information for the agency. A social worker contacted them directly to verify the discrepancies between what they'd claimed on official forms and what the evidence and documentation actually showed clearly and undeniably. They were asked to explain why they'd marked no contact, when phone records and witness statements proved otherwise conclusively, and without any doubt. Their carefully curated image of being responsible, honest, upstanding people in the community began to crumble under official scrutiny they couldn't escape from or talk their way out of. They couldn't charm or manipulate their way out of documentation and hard evidence that contradicted their claims directly. For once in their lives, their actions had real consequences they couldn't avoid or deflect onto someone else conveniently, as they usually did. My parents became suddenly cautious in how they spoke about me to others after that review process was completed. They were worried, I learned later through relatives who still talked to them regularly, about being perceived publicly as dishonest or bad parents in the community where they lived. Their social standing and reputation, especially among extended family and their church community where they were very active members, mattered to them more than their actual relationship with me ever had apparently throughout my entire life. Their own actions were finally costing them something tangible: respect, trust, social capital, standing in the community they valued so highly. They started trying to backtrack and reframe their behavior as a misunderstanding or miscommunication with the agency, but it was far too late for that strategy to work. Too many people had seen the truth in black and white on official documents that couldn't be explained away, and their credibility was permanently damaged in ways they couldn't repair no matter what they said or did moving forward. I didn't argue with them publicly, expose them on social media platforms where everyone could see, or confront them in dramatic fashion at family events for attention. I simply kept living truthfully and honestly, documenting my progress and rebuilding my life one day at a time, with dignity and self-respect. The social worker's documentation and official records proved everything without me needing to create drama or convince anyone of anything through arguments or emotional displays. My parents were left to explain themselves to people they had once convinced so easily with their selective version of events that painted me as the problem. The truth did all the heavy work I could never have done through confrontation or argument or emotional appeals to family members. Their lies collapsed naturally under the weight of evidence and documentation, and I didn't have to lift a finger to make it happen or orchestrate their downfall in the family. With steady work at a new job and healthy new routines I'd established, I slowly rebuilt my life from the ground up over many months of hard work. My support system was smaller than it had been, but infinitely more sincere and reliable and trustworthy than my family ever was. The people in my life now were there because they chose to be, not because of obligation or blood relation or social expectation or pressure from others. The hardship I'd endured had reshaped my social circle into something healthier and more authentic than what I'd had before with my family of origin. I learned to set firm boundaries with people, to ask for help when I genuinely needed it without shame or embarrassment, and to recognize the difference between people who truly supported me and people who simply wanted to control the narrative about me for their own purposes or image. My apartment was small and modest, but it was mine, paid for with my own work and effort, and that felt like an enormous accomplishment I could be genuinely proud of achieving on my own. Months later, my parents remained distant, but they no longer held any power over the narrative or my life anymore at all. The extended family knew the truth, and most had made their own judgments about my parents' character and behavior toward their own child during a crisis. I no longer needed answers from them or apologies that would never come anyway, because they couldn't admit fault or wrongdoing. Their acknowledgement or approval stopped mattering to me entirely, like a switch had been flipped in my mind and heart. My success and independence, modest as they were compared to others, became the final silent closure I needed to move forward with my life without them. The parents who had tried to erase me from official paperwork were now watching from a distance, as I thrived without them in my life at all or their influence. Their lies had backfired completely. Instead of making me disappear, they'd exposed their own cruelty and dishonesty to everyone who mattered in our community and family network. And I had moved forward without them, building a life that was entirely my own, free from their manipulation and control and judgment and conditional love that was never really love at all. That freedom and independence was worth more than any apology they could have offered or any relationship we might have had if they'd been different people.